Hey everyone, Dr. L here with your week 2 video. So let's go ahead and dive into sociological perspective and theories. So again, we have our agenda. I have some housekeeping things I want to talk to. I want to continue introducing the course to you, specifically covering how to navigate eLearn and finding the various things you need to be successful in our class. Then we'll do a review of content from week 1, followed by lecture, exit pass, and reminders. Okay, so as far as your exit pass, there are no dumb questions, and there's no such thing as too many questions. Seriously, I make mistakes, I get confused, I've asked questions that I then felt silly about, and so I understand, and you can ask me anything you want. And if you have lots of questions, that's okay because part of my job is to answer student questions and emails. If you have a lot to talk about, whether it's questions or you just are really excited about course content, I'm always happy to talk to you during virtual office hours, which you can find details about that on our syllabus. And then I've been sending out a Zoom link for those. It'll hopefully be the same Zoom link consistently every Tuesday and Thursday. So make sure you save that information. But I also know, especially after reading the exit pass, many of you work full time. A lot of you have 9 to 5 jobs. Some of you are high school students, so you are required to go to your high school during the day. So if you're not able to go to my office hours, or you have another class, whatever the case might be, I am always happy to schedule a one-on-one Zoom meeting with you to touch base, answer questions, and stuff like that. Now, sometimes in the exit passes, I ask fairly generic questions about how your week's going, how material in class is going, and things like that. But this week, I'm going to be asking you 2 really important questions that have the potential to impact the rest of our semester. So make sure you are doing the exit pass every week. But if you sometimes forget, I understand, just make sure you definitely do the exit pass for this week because, like I said, it will be really important long term for our semester. And then I just want to point out that the response to the exit pass for week 1 was a little bit low, so don't forget that. And if you have any other questions that you were asking in the exit pass that I didn't go over just now, make sure you send me a follow-up email or a reminder about your question in the exit pass for this week, week 2. As far as housekeeping, I just want to make sure everyone is able to properly access our eLearn page. You're able to access our textbook, which remember is free. If you go to our syllabus on the first page, there's a link that will take you to our free online textbook. And then there's also a link on that website page for our textbook for the audio version of our book. So make sure that you are accessing that regularly and keeping up with the readings. And then if you have any other questions related to Sinclair or our class, again, you can post that in the past. You can email me. You can attend my virtual office hours or my in-person office hours if you're also taking face-to-face classes. And if none of that works for you, you can always ask me to meet up one-on-one on Zoom. Don't forget to submit your signed class agreement as soon as possible. Remember, that's just a way to ensure that everyone in the class, you, me, your classmates, agree upon the rules, guidelines, and expectations for the semester. So that's really important. You also have discussion to do. It's on sociological theory and current events. It's due this week, week 2, Sunday at 11:59 p.m. And remember, you need to respond to classmates. So don't forget that component of your discussion boards because it is worth 5 points. And then if you have anything you'd like to share with your classmates, you can always let me know. Maybe you're involved with the student newspaper at Sinclair and you want us to read an article you wrote. Maybe you're a part of intramural sports and you have something really exciting to share with the rest of your classmates about getting involved on campus. I'm always happy to facilitate those types of things to sort of mirror what a face-to-face class would look like in online spaces. All right, so I do know that there's at least a handful of students after reading the exit pass from week one who are struggling with how to navigate eLearn. So maybe you aren't able to find all of the resources you need in order to complete assignments. Maybe you don't know how to submit assignments. So I do want to spend a minute showing you what eLearn should look like for you in student mode. Another thing I want to point out too before we move on is, why do I make these videos? One, they mirror a face-to-face class. This is about as close to a face-to-face lecture as you can get. I have PowerPoints that are very similar to my face-to-face classes, and I'm talking to you in real time. That means that because I adapt course material throughout the semester based off of exit pass feedback, based off of how much progress students in the class are making and things like that, I can't just make all 16 weekly videos at the beginning of the semester. That's why you'll notice typically I make these videos on either Thursday or Friday, and then I post them at the end of the week for the following week. I know that can be challenging if you're one of those students who has a lot on your plate with work, other classes, family commitments, because you may want to work ahead. The weekly videos I make and the weekly PowerPoints I create for you, they are never going to be posted early. They will always be posted toward the end of the week prior to the week you need to watch and review that material. I know that can be a little annoying or frustrating. However, it really is the best way for me to mirror face-to-face engagement in an online class. So bear with me, and I hope it makes you feel like you're getting to know me better. I hope it makes you feel like you're getting an authentic intro to sociology experience, because you're not just regurgitating things from a textbook. You're not just working at your own pace in these online modules. You're also getting the PowerPoints in the lecture that a more traditional face-to-face student would have. All right, so I think that about sums up this slide. I'm going to go ahead and get out of this so that I can show you what our eLearn page looks like in student mode. So if you go to my.sinclair.edu and you log in using your Sinclair login credentials, you will get to a page that looks something like this, and you'll see all of your classes listed. Of course, mine are entrepreneur sociology classes. And so I believe this is our online class. And then if I go to, actually, I'm going to pause for just a second because I need to pull up our class list, and I don't want to have everyone in the class be able to see the other students who are enrolled. Well, actually, you can already see that based off the discussion board, so I think it's okay. So I'm just going to quickly go to student demo. Whoops. I'm going to impersonate this student demo. And now I'm a student, right? So I'm no longer in professor mode on eLearn. Okay. And so this is what our eLearn page should look like. If you're still a little behind and you haven't done everything for week one, here's all of the stuff to get us started. One of the most important things you need to do for our class, which should have been done in week one, but I know people are still adjusting to the new semester. Some of you may be enrolled late or got dropped because of financial aid and are now re-enrolled. You have to take this course overview quiz. You cannot access the content in an online class or a blended class, actually, in our department without completing that course overview quiz and getting 100%. Now, you can take it as many times as you need to, but you have to get 100% in order to access content on our eLearn page. And I know that's been an issue for some students where they emailed me saying, hey, I can't find stuff on our eLearn page. And come to find out it was because they hadn't completed that quiz. But the good news is you get points for doing it. So at least you're getting compensated through class points, right? Our course textbook is linked here. You can access that. The important documents page, currently that has just the syllabus and our course schedule, but as we progress throughout the semester, other important course documents will be in that folder. So, for example, there will be stuff related to rubrics and how you'll get graded. When we have an exam, the exam study guide will go in this folder a week before the due date for that exam. So just make sure you always know how to access documents in that folder. You click on it and you get to see it here. Remember the class line agreement I was talking about? You're going to submit that here. And so if you go here, you go to assignment, add file, go to my computer, find the file you have where your name is on that last page of the syllabus, which is a syllabus agreement, and then upload it. Okay. And then once you've uploaded it, you'll click submit. And then here you'll see the first 4 weeks of content are available other than the PowerPoint and the video from me for weeks 3 and 4. Because remember how I just explained how that works. I don't make available all 16 weeks worth of modules because I think that's overwhelming, but I do like to give you a couple of weeks in advance. That way you can start working ahead if you need to. So while you can't view this PowerPoint and video early, you can, for example, view quizzes, discussion boards, stuff like that. So let's look at week 2. Sociological theory and perspective. Here's a checklist, which is pretty handy so you can ensure that you do everything you need to and you're not missing any assignments or anything important. And you can see here, you need to take chapter 1 quiz, and you have a discussion board due this week. And so you can scroll down through the various modules. These modules really align nicely with the chapters in your textbook. There's some other videos. They're not my videos, but there are videos here. And then the assignments typically are at the end of this list. So your discussion forum, click on that. Quiz 1, go to quiz, start quiz. Remember 10 multiple choice questions for the weekly reading quizzes with 20 minutes to complete them. You have 2 attempts, although you only have to take it once. And then if you take both attempts by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. for that week, I will average your 2 scores, and that will be the final score that hits the grade book for our class. If you forget to take the quiz a second time by Sunday at 11:59 p.m., your first quiz score will stand. And then if you go back, you'll see week 3 is very similar, right? So you have all the different modules, you have your checklist, you have your discussion, you have your quiz. So that's pretty standard as far as navigating our eLearn page. And I hope that just makes you feel more confident that you know where all of the things are. You can access all the content so that you're prepared for the assignments. And then you know where the assignments are located so that you can complete all those things and stay up to date in our class. If you ever want to check your grade, you can click here. That can be useful. But I do always like to remind students, don't rely on eLearn to calculate your grade because sometimes it does weird things as far as trying to weight the grade in the grade book. So make sure you're calculating and adding up all the points that you've earned so far in the grade book, and then divide that by the number of points possible to earn so far. So let's say there's been 200 points so far in the semester. Add up how many points you've earned. Let's say it's 180 points because you missed a couple of quizzes or you didn't get 100% on everything. And then you divide by 200. That percentage is going to be your score, which may not necessarily reflect perfectly with what the grade book on eLearn says. And that's typically an issue on all learning management systems at most schools. So it's just a good habit to have. Alrighty, so we are going back to the PowerPoint now. So week 1, we started with foundational theories, the quote unquote founding fathers of sociological theory, if you will. So I just want to review this. I tend to review and start my lectures each week with a review of what we did last week so you can kind of get into the groove of things. And so week 2 is no exception. If you remember nothing else after you've taken the final exam and seen your grade for SOC 1101 through the registrar's office. Remember these three guys and the theories that they are known for. So we have Weber and symbolic interactionism, thinking a lot about bureaucracy, especially as societies went through the industrialization process. We have Marx and conflict theory. So thinking about how, again, through industrialization, there tends to be a lot of exploitation of the workers in the factories. And how can we make their lives better? And then finally, Durkheim and structural functionalism. So how does society hold together? How do we maintain our bonds and our traditions when we see rapid growth within society? And you'll also see these three guys and their theories come up quite a bit in the beginning of our textbook as well. On that note, a question I want you to keep in mind as you're reading the first couple of chapters in our textbook, and you're working on week 1 and 2 material is, who are some other theorists mentioned in chapter 1, and how are they important? How do they contribute to the field of sociology? One person who should come to mind is C. Wright Mills and his theory of the sociological imagination, which you're essentially required to use weekly in all the discussion boards that you'll be posting. So there's some other folks. I believe it's either chapter 1 or chapter 2 in your textbook has sort of a timeline and a list of a bunch of important theorists who really helped develop the field of sociology. So keep track of that, because that's the type of thing that's likely to show up on quizzes and exams and stuff like that. Okay, so these are some additional foundational concepts. There is going to be some overlap with these terms and what you're reading in your textbook, but these are my own hot take on foundational concepts to the field of sociology that I introduce at the beginning of every semester when I teach intro sociology and actually intro criminal justice classes as well. So these are my own personal definitions. You may see some nuances with how the textbook authors define these terms, but you'll also see there's a lot of similarity as well. And this is also a good way for you to see, like, how can you find terms in our textbook and then adapt the definitions so that you're stating the same ideas and concepts, but in your own words, right? Because this is me doing that for these key terms. All right. So social institutions. Social institutions are social structures or mechanisms that organize our everyday lives. These are sort of the, quote, big things that we can't really change as individuals. Now, one of my things I've noticed over the years is that sociologists tend to not define this term as much as they like to give examples. So it's really important that you know how to define this term. Some examples are family, education, politics, religion, and stuff like that. Now, sometimes students will push back and they'll say, well, I'm not religious and I wasn't raised religiously, so religion doesn't organize my life in any meaningful way. But to that, I would say, okay, well, what days of the week do you work? What days of the week do you take classes? Especially when you were in high school and elementary school, K through 12. It's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, right? That's based off of the Judeo-Christian calendar. So religion still influences different aspects of our lives. It organizes when we're most likely to work and take classes, even if we ourselves are not necessarily super religious. If we don't go to church every Sunday, we don't go to synagogue every Saturday. Still, religion as a social institution influences and organizes our lives. Intersectionality is the interconnectedness of systems of oppression, looking at race, class, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, ableism, sizeism, and other aspects of our identities to answer questions about how these forms of privilege and oppression overlap and intersect. Now, oftentimes when students are introduced to this term, it's easiest to think about things on a micro scale. So how does intersectionality relate to our everyday lived experiences? Based off of our own identities, we have a unique lived experience. So that's an easier way to make connections between these terms and what you're learning in your intro social class in your life. But we can also start to extrapolate up and think about how these different identity categories also influence the big picture. They influence social institutions. So if we think about gender as an example, and we think about education as a social institution, the type of major you're more likely to go into, and therefore the type of career you're more likely to or most likely to have when you graduate, is very much influenced based off of gender as an identity category. We know, for example, that nursing, which is a very common major here at Sinclair, is feminized in our society. There are more women taking nursing classes and going into nursing as a career than there are men. We know that STEM tends to be a masculine field of study and profession, although there are certainly a lot of efforts being made to incorporate women and girls into STEM classes, but that is still a gendered way of thinking about majors and career pathways and stuff like that. Now, the next 3 bullet points have to do with ways we can analyze the social world around us. So our micro scale everyday lives, as well as the big scale social institutions. So the first thing is structure and agency. Often we as individuals like to think we have a million choices available to us. But when we start to think about these things here, slowly the amount of choices we have diminishes. So if we think about something like fashion and how we dress, we like to think we can wear anything we want to. But if you walk into a store to buy clothes, TJ Maxx, Kohl's, JCPenney's, Target, usually there are boys and girls sections and men's and women's sections. So already based off of your age and your gender, you're going to go to a particular part of the store to look for clothes, right? And then based off of your socioeconomic status, your social class, probably you're going to shop at certain stores, right? So if you're not as wealthy, you're probably going to shop at TJ Maxx and Target. If you're wealthier, you're probably going to, I don't even know where you would shop, Coach, designer stuff, things like that, right? And so we can start to think about how we actually have very limited choices in our everyday lives based off of our identity categories. So how much structure exists in our society versus how much agency exists in our society. The next thing is macro and micro. So thinking about the scale of analysis, are we thinking sociologically on a smaller scale based off of our everyday lived experiences? Or are we thinking about things on a macro scale, looking at the big picture and thinking about social institutions? And then we talk a lot about culture in sociology classes. In fact, culture is going to be on an upcoming slide, and it's also defined as a key term in chapter 1 of your textbook. But one thing that's important to think about is how there's material aspects of culture, so physical things in our society. For example, I'm sitting on a stool now, and my computer is on a table. These are material, physical things that exist in our social world. But we assign meaning to those physical aspects, those material things in our society. When you look at a stool, you know it's a stool and you know it's for sitting. When you look at a table, you know that it's meant for, I don't know, eating off of or working from, right? However, someone could sit on a table. When I'm lecturing in face-to-face classes, I often do that at the table that's in the front of the classroom. And so we can start to think about those material aspects of our culture and what they represent and what we assign to those things. However, there is also non-material culture, and sometimes that's not as obvious to students. So things like language and music, those are aspects of our culture, but they're not physical things that we can touch and feel and that sort of thing. Okay, continuing on. The term systemic refers to fundamental and deeply rooted aspects of social structures and how they sort of infiltrate the very fabric of our everyday lives. We tend to say things like systemic racism, systemic sexism, and other isms are often referred to as being systemic. What that means in a nutshell is that these social institutions have systemic racism and sexism and other isms embedded in them. So if we think about the example I gave of education, the fact that men and women are heavily encouraged to go into different types of majors and therefore different types of careers, where masculine coded careers tend to pay more and feminine coded careers tend to pay less, that is systemic sexism. And the same is also true for systemic racism. This isn't about individuals being sexist or racist. We're not focusing on that for our purposes in sociology. We're thinking about how the very social structures that organize our everyday lives sort of just have these things in them. And then we can start to think about, well, how can we make changes to improve these social institutions that organize our lives so that these things don't exist, or at least aren't as bad as they used to be. Now, when we're thinking about society, we often categorize a society based off of whether it's an individualistic society or a collectivist society. So in individualism societies, the focus is really on individual people. It's this mindset of how can I benefit myself? How can I be successful? Versus in collectivist societies, the focus tends to be more on the community. How am I contributing to my community to make it a better place? And so often Western societies tend to be more individualistic and Eastern societies tend to be more collectivist. If we think about Japan, South Korea, China, those Eastern countries tend to have more of a collectivist type of mentality because they're historically they are collectivist societies versus in Western society, historically, we tend to be more individualistic, focusing on the individual person. There's nothing good or bad about either. They just are. And as we continue to globalize and have connections with folks from other parts of the world, especially with, social media taking on a life of its own and stuff like that, there tends to be more and more blending of these two types of societies. But for our purposes in an intro sociology class, it's important to know that there's two very distinct ways in which society tends to operate based off of being collectivist versus individualistic. And then the last key term that I want to introduce to you as a foundational concept from my own repertoire is neoliberalism, which is a commodification of social institutions and social processes. Now, because we all either work or go to Sinclair, which is a college, I think education is a really good social institution to use as an example when I'm talking about applying different key terms to a social institution. And so thinking about neoliberalism and the commodification of social institutions, this is no exception. So we'll use education as an example. So it used to be back in the day, as students like to say, education was a place for us to all learn. We're just here to learn. But as the workforce has sort of evolved over the past few decades in our society, at least in the United States, and having a college degree becomes increasingly more important for having a, quote, good job where you make a living wage. Education, and college specifically, has become commodified. It's about making money. It's not so much about the learning process, it's about learning money. And so if you think about registering for classes and paying your tuition, the way that registering for classes looks is very similar to how you would do online shopping. You go to all the available classes, you search and click on the classes you want, you add them to your cart, and then you sort of go through this process of figuring out your financial aid and paying for them. So it very much mirrors the shopping experience, the commodification process. Even though historically education was supposed to be this place where we're learning, it really is about like money coming in from tuition dollars and then the potential money going out as far as when you graduate, how much money are you going to make, right? Because you got that degree and you have these career opportunities available to you. And so other social institutions are also commodified, and we refer to that as neoliberalism. Okay. From the textbook, Foundational Concepts from Chapter 1. Culture is a group's shared practices, values, and beliefs. The sociological imagination, which of course is an integral part of our class, you should be incorporating this idea into essentially all of your discussion posts, just refers to connecting the private to the public and then thinking about how our everyday lives are sociological and how that connects to broader social institutions and also social problems, whether that's historical social problems or contemporary social problems. Our lives and what we're going through in our unique lived experiences, all of that's connected. Cultural patterns are social forces and influences that put pressure on people to select one choice over another. Sociologists try to identify these general patterns by examining the behavior of large groups of people living in the same society and experiencing the same societal pressures. And that kind of has a connection to that structure agency analysis that I mentioned a couple slides ago. Paradigms are philosophical and theoretical frameworks used within a discipline to formulate theories, generalizations, and the experiments performed in support of them. So in chapter 1 of our textbook, the authors write about paradigms in relationship to the, quote, founding fathers of sociological theory, so Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And you'll see what they do with that. And then finally, I encourage you to think about, actually I just said, what are the 3 main paradigms mentioned in chapter 1? And so I just gave you the answer to that question. Be thinking about that as you work on week 2 material. Okay, continuing on, a hypothesis is this thing that happens once a theory is developed. I mean, a lot of people have contributed to it and worked on it for a while. This is how we test that theory. Now, hypotheses can look different depending on the type of data you collect. So in a more traditional sense, you might go through like the scientific theory of like coming up with a hypothesis. But if you collect more unconventional data, perhaps you just have a statement. This is my hypothesis. This is what I expect to find when I collect data. And then once you've collected that data and you've analyzed it, you'll say, yes, what I hypothesized was true, or no, it wasn't. And so in, I think it's either textbook chapter 1 or 2, they talk about 2 main types of data. And then eventually, I believe it's week 3, we'll go into greater detail and drill down into specific types of data collection. And then I'll also throughout the semester in these weekly videos, try and introduce you to different types of data collection and different research projects I've worked on throughout my career, because I think that can really help to show you not just textbook examples of data collection, but what does data look like in the real world? Social solidarity. This has to do with social ties within a group. This is another one of Durkheim's early contributions to the field of sociology. And so he was asking questions along the lines of, how does an individual issue such as suicide impact society and social ties? So I think if we bring up the issue of suicide, we tend to focus on the individual and individuals who are at risk. But Durkheim said, no, let's not just look at that, because that's definitely important, but let's also look at how this is a social problem and how it can have an impact on the broader society, even for individuals who don't have suicidal ideations or don't know anyone personally who has attempted suicide. It still has an impact on our society. And in fact, when he did his research on suicide and how it impacts society more broadly, he was really the first person to collect data as a social scientist and the way that we collect data today. And so the way that Durkheim collect data for this project and other projects he would eventually work on still influences the social sciences today and how we collect data and analyze it. All right. And then constructivism proposes that reality is what humans construct it to be. And we as members of society generally agree upon most things because they're socially constructed. Social constructs can change over time. So, for example, the slang we use in our everyday lives looks different than the slang our parents used, which looks different than the slang our grandparents used. And the slang our kids use, it's going to be different than what we use, right? It can vary by region. So, just as an example, in Ohio, people tend to call the thing that you use when you're at the grocery store a shopping cart. But when I lived in West Virginia, they called it a buggy. And my mom and her family is all from West Virginia. So when I was really little, my mom would call the shopping cart a buggy. And I would say that term in front of my friends and they thought it was funny and they didn't know what it meant. So that's just as an example of how different slang, different words we use can vary by region. And if you're used to using a different word than what's the norm in the region where you live, people are going to look at you funny. Okay, so without further ado, this is a link for the exit pass. I will also email that to everyone later in the week. And then just as a reminder, read chapter 2 in the textbook, start reading chapter 3, submit your signed class agreement as soon as possible, complete chapter 1 quiz, complete discussion 2 on sociological theory and current events. And don't forget to enjoy your week despite all of the heavy lifting you got to do in your intro social class. All right. Bye, everyone.